Throughout the Second World War in Europe, there were many neutral nations who, despite their government's intentions, were unable to stay so. While some, like Finland, were able to resist, others, like Sweden, managed to avoid fighting. Given Sweden's immense natural resources, notably iron, it's even more surprising that it was left alone when the powers around it were fighting for their continued existence. Not only that, but Sweden would have been a valuable ally to whichever side it joined, which raises the question, why didn't Sweden join World War II, and how did it manage to maintain its neutrality and deter aggressors? So, when the war broke out, Sweden declared itself to be a non-belligerent nation. This shouldn't be surprising, since Sweden had been a neutral nation since after the Napoleonic Wars. This was mostly because it was forced to hand over Swedish Pomerania to Prussia, and thus had nothing binding them to mainland continental politics. Thus, by 1939, Sweden had over a century of neutral foreign policy stances behind it. It was governed at this point by Per Albin Hansen, who was doing everything in his power to keep fascist and communist sympathisers away from power. His government was a coalition of four major parties, and their foreign policy goals at first were simply don't get involved in the war. Yet, as many of you will be aware, the war soon came to its neighbours. Finland fought the Winter War against the USSR, and in 1940, both Denmark and Norway were conquered by Germany. To the Finnish-Soviet War, the Swedish were sympathetic to Finland, but there were even some who called for Sweden to formally get involved. Hansen resisted, and so Sweden covertly gave money and weapons to the Finns, and roughly 12,000 Swedes crossed the border to help in non-combat roles. As for Denmark and Norway, Sweden wasn't willing to go to such lengths to help them resist Germany. This was largely for economic reasons. Sweden exported masses of iron ore to Germany throughout the war, but given that everyone else had been conquered, there was no other customer. In case you're wondering, the reason why Germany kept buying the iron instead of simply conquering Sweden was that Hitler assumed that the Allies wouldn't bomb a neutral country. So the only reason that Sweden was able to stay neutral was that it made concessions to both sides. For example, when Germany conquered Norway, the Swedish government allowed German troops to travel through the country. They also allowed German troops to transit the country to Finland in 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This actually led to what's called the Midsummer Crisis, where ministers panicked over what to do because they really didn't want to be seen aiding the Germans in the war with the USSR. In fact, Sweden's King Gustav V said that if the Germans weren't accommodated, that he personally would not be willing to bear the consequences. And so they allowed German troops to cross, and throughout the war, over 2 million German soldiers did so. Of course, Sweden couldn't just give in to what the Germans wanted, since at that point they may as well have just been a member of the Axis. And as such, Sweden was sure to aid the Allies too. For example, it took thousands of Jewish refugees from Denmark and all over Europe, as well as giving refuge to socialists and political dissidents. And furthermore, Sweden also took to covertly training Norwegian troops in its territory. They were also active in conducting espionage against Germany, and troop movements and industrial information to the British and the Americans. And in the end, Sweden's neutrality in the war carries a confusing legacy. Avoiding occupation and bombing was the priority for the government, and they did achieve that. They did so by facilitating German troop movements and providing it with valuable resources with which it could power its war machine. That said, what real choice did Sweden have? Denmark and Norway were conquered for reasons of strategy, and the Germans would have happily done the same to Sweden, and Sweden was sure to balance it, pervading the Allies and giving refuge to Europe's persecutors. In the end, Sweden stayed neutral by doing just enough to avoid the ire of both sides. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. With extra thanks to our Patreon supporters, which you can see on screen. And with an extra special thanks to James Bizanet, David Archaeologist, Azarka Flash, Party Boyko, Rob Waterhouse, Chris Wicker, Michael Reynolds, Gustav Swan, David Silverman, Spinning Three Plates, Maggie Paxkowski, Christian Chepe, Anthony Beckett, Ike, Sky Chappelle, and Winston David.
Wow, he's talking too fast, right? But did you kind of understand what he was saying? Yes or no? I'm going to show you more.
In this series, I've looked at the roles of countries not normally associated with the Second World War and asked what did they do during that most famous of these conflicts. But in today's video, I'd like to shine that spotlight on Sweden and what Sweden did during the Second World War. Now, if you look back at Sweden's history from the Vikings and through to the Great Northern War and struggles with Russia, it's quite a warlike history. So it might surprise you that after around 1809 with the Napoleonic War, 1812, with the last invasion, Sweden had actually remained at peace and would do so until the start of the Second World War in Europe in 1939. During this time, Sweden became a lot smaller geographically as it essentially shared Finland, which became a new country to its east. During the First World War, Sweden decided to remain neutral, and in the post-war years, there was a very strong socialist movement in Sweden that was generally split between a smaller, more radical communist wing and a more liberal social democratic wing, both of whom wanted to bring about reforms. At the same time, there was a backlash from more conservative
emboldened by the fact that in the Bolshevik Revolution broke out in Russia. And in the following years, the Russian Empire would fall following the Russian Civil War. It would be completely replaced by the world's first communist government, the USSR, the Soviet Union, which was aided by many of the Swedish communists who wanted to spread that communist revolution into Sweden as well. It was during these years, in the early 1930s, that Sweden decided its best position with ruling social democrat government was to stand between the rising powers of the Soviet Union, who threatened Sweden directly, and the rising march of the Nazis in Germany. During these years, Sweden